But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Let's begin it.
Number ZZ9 plural Z alpha. Number ZZ9. I said I've never seen such hideousness in all my life.
Listen to all this,
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Let's begin it.
Number ZZ9 plural Z alpha. Number ZZ9. I said I've never seen such hideousness in all my life.
Listen to all this,
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Number ZZ9 plural Z alpha. Number ZZ9. I said I've never seen such hideousness in all my life.
That's a lot of this,
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
But the senator, while indoctrinated, could not explain his toxicity.
You should not listen to men's rights advocates if you want to know what they have to say.
Let's be at it.
There we go. I didn't think my scene was going to change for me for a second. But hello, and welcome to HBR Talk 309. What about gender roles during the American Revolution? I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with Nonsense Annihilator Lauren Brooks, and we're going to continue our talk about the context surrounding the development of voting in early America, as part of our greater context around the development of voting in countries influenced by British colonialism and British common law, English common law. But first, before we do that, we got to do what we got to do. As always, Honey Badger Radio dishes out a smorgasbord of thought-provoking discussions, and as experiences both recent and long past have demonstrated, the provoked thoughts are fighting back. They've made it clear that for people like us, relying on third-party payment platforms like Patreon to fund our work is treading on thin ice, or building our house in the path of a rapidly growing wildfire. In light of this, we strongly encourage our supporters to switch at least their support for us to feedthebadger.com, the most stable way to help us out. And if you want to tip us directly instead of relying on any social media platform's tip jar, the link for that is feedthebadger.com/justthetip. And as always, the same risk applies to our social media platforms, which is why you should further provoke the thought police by tracking our thought-provoking discussions on honeybadgerbrigade.com, where you can find your way to all of our content, as well as a link to feedthebadger.com in the drop-down menu at the top of the page. And to find me, you guys might need that, because I have been provoking thoughts on Twitter, and they are mad. I got two sex changes in the same night.
Oh my God.
Yep. I became a man twice.
How's it feel?
Oh, very masculine. Elevating. I am the patriarchy.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's amazing. It's amazing to me how sad and pathetic that women have allowed themselves to become in mass, like in general, in modern America. And I'm going back and forth, right? Between if I'm on Twitter, it's because I'm getting interrupted so much that I can't focus on the things that I'm studying because they take a little more work than Twitter does. Twitter is just like a thing, like, well, I got time for this. Or I can't walk away from the room I'm in, but I can use this to distract myself in between things that are interrupting my studies, right? But I'm looking at women's roles during the prior to and during the Revolutionary War here in America, and I just can't imagine if I pulled one of those women into the 21st century and got her into a conversation with modern women about the issues around abortion, birth control, pregnancy, custody, child support, and all that. I think those women would actually get violent. I think they would kill the women. They'd be like, heathens! What happened to our country? What did you do to our country? Because they were very loyal to their husbands. They cared very deeply about their families. They used all of the tools available to them to their own benefit and to the benefit of the people around them as best they could. They didn't all agree on everything, and they got really heated in their debates with each other about things they didn't agree on. But they didn't play victim of their own choices.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that galls me so much. I get on Twitter and I get into this argument. I'm in this thread that's been going on since like February. And no, it's might have been April of last year actually. There's been this discussion's been going on for a long time, but the specific thread was started by a chick who was trying to promote the idea that it is not an abuse of men's rights to sort of draft them into child support, right? And so, of course, there's the discussion of what tools women have available to determine whether or not they are single moms with custody of a child at the end of the decision-making, the whole string of decision-making that takes place between hello and now you're a single mom. But they stop at, like feminists stop at the part of the sex act that is fun for a guy, and they want to blame everything that happens afterward on that moment. Because if you would acknowledge that the woman went on from that moment and didn't make decisions that were beneficial to herself and the people around her, didn't use the tools available to control the outcome so that it could be better for her and the people around her, and then is demanding money, for that, like, they have no argument left. When you start pointing those things out to them, well, that's how I get those internet sex changes. and I keep looking back. So our subject today, because I've been having that discussion and I've been reading this history, and I've been looking into all of the context related to men's voting rights being, completely connected, inextricably connected to conscription, and women's voting rights just being accepted as rights. And there's not actually a valid excuse for that. So that's what we're kind of going to look at today. I'm going to be jumping back and forth between different articles, because conscription during the Revolutionary War was not quite the same as it is today. Obviously, they didn't have the lottery system because they didn't have the equipment that would be used to track that. They didn't have anything to do with the modern system. They didn't have social security numbers. They didn't have, they couldn't easily track you down if you just chose to go running off into the inner part of the continent and not serve. It was less involuntary than it is today. It would be harder to chase you down and arrest you. Now, granted, not everybody could just go off into the woods and live there. There were other circumstances that might have prevented that. But I mean, just a reminder, one of my earliest ancestors into this in this country was sent here. He was conscripted in Britain. He was impressed into the British military, meaning he was kidnapped and shipped overseas against his will. He was not just drafted. And when he got here, he decided, fuck that, and jumped ship, swam ashore, fled inland, and went all the way into what is now Ohio, which at the time was part of Canada, so that he would not have to fight, because he was 14 years old. It wasn't his battle. He didn't want anything to do with that shit, and that was that. So it could be done.
Wow. 14. That's insane to think about.
Well, yeah. And that's so we actually have a couple of different articles here. One of them is child soldiers of the Revolutionary War. So both sides did have very young people involved. But we'll point this out as I go through that article, and I'll try to do it more on a brief level. You'll notice something. They say child soldiers, but look and see if you see girls' names.
Did you stop screen sharing, by the way?
No, I did not. I don't think I did. Did it? It ended for me. Okay, let's try that again. Share your screen. Go live. Must have cut me off. I don't know why. There we go. All right, so the stream should be available to you now.
Yeah, cool.
All right. So we're going to start with the American militia and the origin of conscription. This is actually a fairly old piece, and I'm not going to go through and read the whole thing about the author talking about revising it. He'd been intending to, but chose not to. But he does point out that there's actually a lot of documentation on which to base the information in this. So I'm not going to go through and read like every page of it, but I don't think. But what I will point out is people do say that conscription was created in America for the Civil War. And this is what he starts with, too. According to established mythology, American citizens were not conscripted until the Civil War. First, the Confederacy and then the Union resorted to the draft to fill their depleting armies. Prior to that, this mythology holds no draft existed in the United States. The U.S. government fought the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War solely with volunteers. Toward the end of the War of 1812, the Madison administration did call for conscription, but this request failed due to Daniel Webster's stirring and frequently reprinted denunciation of the draft on the floor of Congress. Unfortunately, this halcyon portrait is false in nearly every respect. So that's the first thing. Like, people don't realize this. I was taught in school that conscription started with the Civil War. So this has been misconstrued to school kids and to the general public for a long time. Because when I was in school, we're talking, I started school in the late 70s and graduated in 1991. But he goes on to say the only U.S. war fought without conscripts before the Civil War was the Mexican War. American government, state or national, drafted men not only to fight the Revolution and the War of 1812, but also to wage Indian wars and to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion. So conscription, this country started with conscription. It existed from the beginning. And that's something that people don't understand. Military experts privy to the compulsory nature of the militia and the implications of such arcane phrases as calling forth the militia have failed to communicate their knowledge to outsiders. This is how people don't understand. Indeed, the militia's coercive elements lasted until they were discontinued during the Jacksonian era. And I need to link this. I think I'm gonna link this in the low bar, or at least in the blog post, because it's probably something people should read. I'm not going to read all the footnotes, but I think people ought to have access to it. So you see there's quite a bit here.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, just that's all footnotes. Right. And so he has a lot. He's not just talking out of his ass. This guy actually has done a significant amount of research to write this and explain this. And they're probably still teaching the wrong thing in schools. If you got kids in school, they're probably, if they're learning about conscription at all, they're probably learning that it didn't exist until the Civil War. So this is the part that we're going to focus on right here. The colonial period and the American Revolution is what's relevant to what we're discussing. The militia system was originally transported to the American colonies from England. At the outset, it was grounded in the principle of universal obligation, right? And it says universal obligation, but who are they talking about? They're not talking about women, right?
Nope.
And you remember when we've talked about the origin of the militia system in British law and British culture, that came from the Fyrd, which was sort of the early proto-militia system of medieval England, when it was the king and his vassals and his knights and their knights, and the service was to the king, the service was to the vassals of the king, and the men of the community could be pressured into it, but they were more likely to be hired for it. So there was coercive coercive details in regard to it, but at the same time, they preferred men who wanted to step up and defend their communities and their country, not men and boys who were forced into it, because men who want to do it are going to do it better.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's my argument against conscription today. There are people of both sexes who want to be in the military. And it's mostly men. Like, even today, when there are no barriers for women getting into the military, and the barriers to women serving on the front lines are actually being systematically removed.
Hey, I hear you can get a free you can get a free transgender surgery if that's your gig.
Why would you do that? But I mean, like, there's no barriers, but the military is still only 14% women.
Yeah.
So, transgender surgery. Yeah, I suppose. I don't know. Maybe women want to go that want to go into the military might want to become men. Who knows? I've met plenty of female soldiers that were quite feminine and didn't want a sex change. And I'm not sure, like, what would you do? You go into the military, you get a sex change, you now have to have consistent medical care for the rest of your life that would actually keep you from being activated for duty.
Right. Exactly. But, I mean, geez, you think anybody on Biden's administration would think that far? No, but this is the direction that we're going in now.
Yeah.
But just doesn't make sense. Our system is completely upside down and fucked. Everything is the opposite of what they want it to be. Our military is not as strong as we like to think that we are, but
Yeah.
I don't know. God forbid one of these wars comes knocking on our back door. We're screwed. We're
Yeah.
screwed.
All right, the military has a purpose. It's a very specific, unique, limited purpose, right? The purpose of the military is to protect the nation
Hmm.
from being taken over and controlled by another nation. That is it. That is all your military is supposed to be doing. If you're a malicious country, then your military is going to get used like our country has been using our military to impose change on other countries against their will. But it's not supposed to be that way. Your military is supposed to be your defense against malevolence from other countries. So, not that the law should take away people's right to make decisions about their bodies. Like if you decide you want to have a surgery, it shouldn't matter whether you want bigger tits or to cut them off and become a man or whatever. The law shouldn't interfere with that, other than the fact that you can sue your doctor if the doctor does a bad job and you get infected and have all kinds of problems that you shouldn't be having because the doctor should have done a better job. Right? That's it. That's the extent that the law should be involved. But, the medical community can have their thing. The military should have their thing. The military shouldn't be a pathway that people use to get a surgery they want, or a series of surgeries, or any medical anything. It's bad enough that it's used as a pathway to get rewards that pay for an education that actually leaves them in debt. Basically a pathway into certain business arrangements. It's really not that either. And if that's the primary reason that you're going in, then you're not going to be as useful for the actual purpose of the military. And if the primary reason that you're going in is to get medical procedures done at the expense of the U.S. government, then you don't belong in the military.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not that you shouldn't have a right to pursue those medical procedures, but that you shouldn't have a right to exploit the military as your pathway to pursue those medical procedures.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with that. There is a little part of me that is kind of like, I kind of support getting over on the government in that way, and it sounds so fucked up, and I don't really, obviously it's wrong for all of the reasons that you just said, but that part kind of makes me giggle a little bit, and I just wish that I don't know. I wish that the military, if anyone is listening, Department of Homeland Security, since you want to put us on your little fucking list, how about you take this whole military action down to the southern border? Oh, what's that? No, we can't actually prevent other countries from literally invading us by walking across our very porous border.
Yeah. Nobody on any side of the border issues would be happy if I was in charge. Like, make me a dictator for a couple of years and I will piss everybody off. Because you know what I will do in regards to the southern border of the U.S.? Like, I will create a pathway for everybody to come through and then be sorted out and educated. Like, that's fine, you can come here, but we're going to indoctrinate you. And that includes, if you're part of a cartel, okay, fine, we will take you and we will put you through cult deprogramming, and then we will indoctrinate you into the concepts of, freedom and democracy. Not,
Yeah.
the concepts of altruism and care and consideration for other people, having a conscience.
Yeah, and if anybody heard that and just, it felt a little icky, that's exactly what they do in China. That's
Yeah.
exactly what they do in China. If you break the law there, they catch you, they imprison you. Oh no, you're going to learn the ways of the CCP.
Yeah.
You will obey one way or the other, So
Well, the ways of
I'm
the
all.
HRW are this: by the time you come out of camp, you will have learned that it's a great thing to be self-supporting through your own labor, and to be the person that checks on your neighbors when there's a storm to make sure that nobody got hurt and nobody needs help, or if they do, you're there to help, and to know your neighbors will do that for you. It's a great thing to step away from an insane, violent environment into a lifestyle where you're part of a community that has bonded together as a community over mutual investment in one's own welfare and the welfare of the people around oneself
Mhm.
through meritocracy.
Absolutely.
Being able to demonstrate that you did a good job, and being appreciative of the good job that other people do, right?
Yeah.
That would that would be it. And then after a few years, I would abandon the position. You'd be like, wait a minute, what? And no, I wouldn't hold elections. I would dissolve the government and simply have a skeleton crew to maintain an actual defensive military. And that would be it. And
Yeah.
the defensive military would be something that the states did independently of each other, but in conjunction with each other and in communication with each other. Because that's kind of what they did during the colonial period. But yeah, that would probably, like I said, it would piss everybody off, because you got the people that are like, no, don't bring people in across the border, and then you also have the people that would be mad because of the indoctrination. But by the
Yeah.
time I got done with it, it would be an entirely evil and horrible thing to do to people, because they would be in camps.
Mhm.
But by the time they got out, they would be ready to live their lives with freedom, independence, and community with their neighbors. And they wouldn't need somebody to tell them what to do.
Yeah. I like that.
Like I said, it would be terrible, actually. Because that is essentially the same use of methods that the woke would use. Right? The no bad tactics. Yeah. There are bad tactics. So the next best thing that you can do in a country, because you would be taking away people's freedom under that circumstance, what's the next best thing you can do? Defend the borders, limit who comes through, vet people who come through, and only let in people who are not going to attack your country.
Absolutely. And to be fair, the people who are doing these jobs, they're not really doing the job, but they're being paid to let this thing happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, the decisions are coming from on high. These people just come in and punch the clock, but it's I don't know if I could do that again. I would be conflicted if I know that this border needs to be protected, but we're just looking the other way. I couldn't do it.
Yeah, it's like I said, if I was forced into a position, because you couldn't pay me enough to make me actually want to become president of the United States, or put into a leadership position like that. If I was forced into a position like that, those would be the two pathways I would look at. I'm going to end up settling on closing the border and limiting who can come in. But to explain why that has to happen, now you know what the alternative is. If we want to preserve a country like the United States, and you want to let everybody in, the only way to achieve that is camps and indoctrination. Right? That's it. Otherwise, you have to have a secure border.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so I'm done scaring the shit out of everybody. But what Dictator Hannah would be like. But back to this article. So remembering that we talked about the evolution of the militia system in England, and we now know, from the article that this system came into the American colonies with the colonists, so it was never not practiced in what would become the United States. At the outset, it was grounded in the principles of universal obligation, which universal meant men. Just to be very blunt, women were never part of this. Women never had to do this. Not under the English system. Not under the British system, right? Maybe under the pre-Roman system, women might have been part of it. Back under the tribal systems, maybe. There's some evidence that some women were. There's not evidence that it was equal. So first it enrolls... practices differed widely from colony to colony, but everywhere the militia had two coercive elements. First, it enrolled every able-bodied male between certain ages, usually 16 to 60. Right, so if it'd be different if you had, for instance, back then they couldn't do anything if you were born with the condition known as clubfoot.
Mm.
You're just kind of going to deal with that for your life. Or if you were born without one of your arms, or if, which was a frequent thing, you lost one to an accident. They couldn't treat infection, so if you had an injury that went deep enough that you got any of the types of infections that could lead to gangrene, they had to cut it off.
Oh.
That was not a... Yeah, medicine was kind of brutal back then.
Damn.
There wasn't a lot they could do. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't they didn't have a full capacity to understand what was causing the infections. They just knew that, your arm was going bad. You had gangrene, and it would spread, and it would eventually get into your blood and kill you, if it hadn't already. So sometimes people got a limb cut off to save their lives, and they died anyway because they were already septic. Right. So Catherine Scully gives us $3 Canadian and says, pair character punching the air with fist and bump written on his knuckles. That's cute. Oh, yeah, so when we were talking about every able-bodied male, they had to have that stipulation because, some people were not. And there wasn't anything they could do about it, and it was a more common thing than you think for somebody to not be able-bodied. Also, Meredith G gave us $5 and said, HBR Talk 309, honey for the badgers. I want to point out that the Second Amendment was not simply about self-defense, but also meant to distribute the responsibility of defense of the nation to the populace. That's correct. Take that into consideration when we look at conscription. Because this is another factor, all right? You had to provide your own weapon at that time. The military didn't issue you weapons, and so you had to provide your own weapon, right?
Oh my god. It's crazy.
Yep. Which
what about
even then, guns were an even bigger, expensive tool than they are now.
What about ammunition?
You had to provide that yourself too.
Jesus.
And you got fined if you didn't. So they had to furnish their own arms and to muster for regularly scheduled training. They would get fined if they didn't. This mandatory training could be as frequent as once a week or more, but as the Indian threat receded, or as the colonists stopped having conflict with the local Indian tribes, most colonies reduced the number of training days to approximately 4 per year. So you got to remember, the other thing is, you think about a military that only trains 4 days a year, you would think, gosh, those guys aren't going to do anything, right? But they didn't go sit at a desk job the rest of the time. They went home and they chopped firewood, or they froze in the wintertime. They grew their own crops. They plowed their own fields. They carried and lifted. They did heavy labor. Everyday life during that time involved heavy labor for men, and pretty heavy labor for women too, although not quite as heavy as what men did. So nobody could just sit around and be wimpy. If they were skinny, it was because they were starving. See, the militia thereby provided a compulsory system of universal military training, which, in my opinion, is superior to waiting until wartime and starting to conscript people. I think, among other things, if we had a system today where all able-bodied youth, male and female, were taught what you need to know if you want to enlist in the military and defend the country during wartime, and that training was maintained throughout high school and what would be the time you're in college, whether you actually attend college or not, even if it was something that you did 1 weekend a month, and you had to stay in shape for it, it would actually solve a lot of problems. Among other things, the issue of widespread obesity in the country would be greatly reduced. But you would also have people would be very much aware of what it would mean for the country to go to war, and they would be very careful who they voted for because of that. So the second coercive element was when the militia is called forth for active military service. This is only in dire emergency, only for a short period, would a militia district deploy its enrolled manpower. Normally when a colonial government called upon its military for a military campaign, it would set quotas for each district. The districts would then try to fill the quotas with volunteers first. And sometimes the colonies would encourage volunteering with bounties. However, if volunteers were insufficient, the districts would then meet their quotas through drafts. Generally, the only legal ways of avoiding such militia drafts were either by paying a stiff fine or hiring a substitute. So, again, this is another big difference between today's military service and the military service of the time. So, let's say you had a job that you could not leave, or your employer couldn't afford to lose you for that time period. Today, the employer or the network of employers for that type of job might have to appeal to the government, please exempt people who do this job from the military draft. And that was done during the Vietnam War for educators. Educators were in very short supply for a while. There was a huge shortage. And so if you were an educator, you could not be drafted during part of the Vietnam War. Close to the end of the war, they eliminated that. But during part of the war, that was a thing. And it wasn't because teachers weren't fit to serve. It's because you can't just hire a whole bunch of new people to replace them. They have to go through 4 years of school, take testing, get time in teaching under an experienced teacher, and then get their certification before they can even contract with a school. So now the military could have just changed the rules. Right? They could have said, well, you don't have to have a teaching certificate to be a teacher. Because you didn't used to. You used to go to six-week course of study called normal school. And when you graduated from that, you were a teacher.
Wow.
Yeah. So when my dad was a student, his teachers were normal school graduates. And it was called normal, Normal, normal. Normal school. I went to weird school. I don't know about you guys, man. That's why I'm kind of a journalist and more of a commentator and not a teacher. This is not education.
I went to an interesting school. It was called Skip.
Yeah. Oh God, that's awful. Oh my God. I got accused of skipping school a lot. And see, that's the other thing. Like I always say I went to school, and I did, about 2/3 of the time. And the other third of the time, I went to the hospital. I didn't spend that much time in the hospital, but I was admitted at least once a year. My poor parents, I can't imagine. They must have spent my whole childhood on the edge of their seats. What is she gonna do to herself next? How is she gonna try to die this year? But in any case, yeah. So different things like that. If there's a shortage and the community feels like it's absolutely necessary to have this particular profession stateside, or away from the military, we can't lose these people. Then they get exempted from the draft, and they do other things too. Like if you are the sole breadwinner for a family and you can't be replaced by another breadwinner in that family. Sometimes that stipulation has been made in the past. The only son in a family is ineligible for the draft. If you have more than one son, then that's a different story. But the only son was ineligible. And I wonder how that will change if they start drafting women. Will they say the only son and the only daughter, or do you have to be an only child to be? To be exempt. All right, so there's a lot of standards that today that there's a maze of ways to get in and out. But back then, if you were in one of those situations where it would be a major burden for your family or major loss for your family beyond the norm of what a burden it would be and what a loss it would be for a family to have their child go to war and not come back, right? Then you paid somebody else to take the job for you. You could pay a stiff fine, and not go. So the threat of conscription was there, and it existed. Like he says, the threat of conscription lurked behind every resort to the seemingly innocuous power to call out the militia, right? But at the same time, it was still more democratic and voluntary than it is today. And yeah, people are mentioning Saving Private Ryan in the chat. That is exactly the type of situation, right? All three of his brothers are gone. Suddenly, he is now much more important to bring home. The military has that stipulation. We don't take all of the boys in a family. We don't take the only boy from family, and that does go back to the beginning, that you don't because it used to be that families relied on their sons when you had the family farm, and most families grew a significant portion of their own food, or raised a significant portion of their own meat, or hunted for a significant portion of their own meat. They relied on the sons just like they relied on the husband and father to provide these things once they got old enough to start doing that, which would be when they got old enough for military service. Well, for conscription into the military as soldiers. So, enforcement of the military's coercive elements was sometimes lax. There were hallowed restrictions upon employment of the militia draft. Colonial governments were not supposed to send drafted militiamen outside the colony. The draftee's term of service was usually limited to 3 months. If they planned long, offensive military expeditions, they relied on militia volunteers who specifically contracted for such expeditions. So if you were going to leave the colony or you were going to do something for a long time for the military, that was volunteer. They didn't just make you do that, like they did with sending men to war during the 20th century, where you would get drafted into the military and then you might be overseas until they could send you back. You might have a term of service, but you could be, your term of service could be extended. Or if you got kidnapped by the other side, if you got captured by the other side, it's not like they were necessarily going to go get you back.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if I need to go through the rest of this. There's differences in how the northern and southern colonies did this, but he does go through and he mentions the volunteer component again. So later on, colonial governments and successor state governments integrated them into general militia systems. Volunteer units provided much of the cavalry, artillery, and elite infantry within the militia. Men could gain exemption from the common militia by joining a volunteer unit, but many remained private fraternities with exclusive memberships. So, again, there were alternatives to being officially a part of the military. But you kind of had, it wasn't just anybody could do that. So even in the 17th century, there was still that coercive component. So, as he says, everything noted so far about the compulsory nature of colonial common militia is well known. Less common known is the fact that the common militia persisted without serious alteration through the Revolution. As the colonies made the revolutionary transition to states, they refurbished their militias to maintain better order, fight the British, and suppress Tories. So Tories were, for people who aren't either American or British, Tories were loyalists to Britain in the colonies. And they fought against the revolutionary colonists to remain part of the British Commonwealth. And I have some family members who are in Canada, that live in Canada, that are descendants of Tories. That after the Revolutionary War, the Tories did not get treated very well, for obvious reasons. And even if they sort of reformed their opinions to, well, now we're a country, so let's unite, there was a lot of conflict between people who had been pro-revolution and people who had been Tories. So it's definitely the need for military service to suppress that I don't want to say terrorism, because it wouldn't be quite the level of terrorism, but I guess rabble-rousing mischief was done quite a bit, and obviously there would have also been fights, just conflict and fights between people.
Yeah.
So the military was sort of the local police force at that time. So one of the things he's talking about here, during Virginia during the spring of 1775, the Patriot Committee increased the frequency of mandatory training days for every male between 16 and 60 to 1 per month. Compulsory militia preparations were far and more widespread than blah 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 than the famed contingents of Minutemen who volunteered to be ready at a moment's notice. so they were definitely maintaining a consistent force, and they were definitely, telling men in the colonies and then later in the states, you will do this. This is required of you. When this, oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I mean, it's one day a month. How long do our recruits go out when they draft these days?
They go.
I have no idea.
They go into boot camp, and they go into. I think boot camp is like 10 weeks. It's like the length of a course of study at university.
Okay.
I might actually be longer than that, although during the Vietnam War they shortened it. Like 6 weeks. But, they got desperate during the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
They were allowing people into the military that were not allowed into the military, and then they started drafting previously because of, not being trustworthy or not being reliable physically or whatever. And then they also started drafting people that would have been exempt under medical restriction or because they would have been considered not reliable. The Alice's Restaurant routine that Arlo Guthrie does, where he talks about going in to register after he's gotten drafted, and talking to the shrink and going, "I want to kill, all that," and then they pinned a medal on him and said, "You're our boy." That was a commentary on there were certain degrees of mental illness that the military would not accept prior to the Vietnam War. That they went ahead and said, "Okay, yeah, we'll take you. You can be a complete homicidal maniac. That's actually good for us. Go kill." And that was acceptable. There was a point during which they took people who were ineligible for military service due to their criminal history and said, "Well, actually, we're going to consider your military service an act of rehabilitation, so you can join the military and get your slate clean by being there." By being in Vietnam.
Yeah, they gonna clean your slate all right.
Yeah.
Right into the next life.
And wash your slate in blood.
Yeah.
If you're lucky, it'll be somebody else's.
Yeah.
And so they sent people who were too intellectually disabled to qualify for military service prior to the standards of the Vietnam War. They sent people who were too blind to qualify.
Wow.
Like my dad did not get drafted. Well, he did not get sent over. They tried to draft him when he was exempt, but he had tried to enlist prior to that when he was young enough that he didn't really have the foresight. And this is the other thing, like they'll take young men who are of an age where they may not fully understand what they're getting themselves into, right? He tried to enlist, and they wouldn't take him because his eyesight was not good enough. His eyesight really was bad. Like, really bad. He memorized the eye test chart. So, it's actually a really funny story. So he memorized the eye test chart. He goes in and he reads it off for the guy's like, "Wow, this is amazing," and he's like, he takes him outside and he asks him to read the license plate on a truck down the street. And my dad, without his glasses on, is looking around and he's like, "What truck?
What truck?"
So they kind of caught him out on that. And he didn't get in. But then years later, when they wanted to force him in, his eyesight was not a problem anymore. It's okay if you can't see.
Oh, dude.
Yeah, so what if you need, like, 2 sets of Coke bottles for your glasses? And when I tell you I'm a multi-generational nerd, my grandfather on my dad's side of the family was an engineer, so... Anyway. But yeah, So it very, very different. When the states put active military forces into the field, they even eventually fell back on militia drafts. Continental Army, with military force as a new national government, was initially composed entirely of volunteers, but as the war dragged on, manpower shortages became acute. And this happens every time there is a war. Why? Obvious reason, right? Because men get killed.
Mm-hmm.
Despite monetary boundaries and land grants offered by both Continental Congress and the individual states, this happens, right? Because you can't pay dead people to come back from the grave.
Right.
Continental Army bid for recruits against the active forces of the 13 state militias. So now you have the two, I guess, leaderships, the two governments within the United States competing for soldiers. Massachusetts began employing conscription in the early summer of 1776. New Hampshire followed in 1777. The most remaining states fell in line upon recommendation of the Congress later that year. States used these drafts not just to man their own forces, but to also fill their quotas for the Continental Army. So, when people tell you that there was no draft in the creation of the United States, they're bullshitting you. The fact that we have a government here to vote for, the fact that we have a United States of America, happened on the blood of drafted men.
Jesus.
Right. But let's talk about the word men here, because we're going to switch stories now. So this story, titled Child Soldiers of the Revolutionary War. And this is kind of a PC title, if you ask me, because I want you to look at that picture and find the girl in it. I can't see one anywhere.
Nope.
Right. Now, that's not a photograph of actual... it's a representation, obviously, because there was no photography. But this is what the reality was. Right. Take a moment, think back to what you were doing at the age of 7, or 10. I was in the first grade at 7.
7, I think I was in second.
Yeah, I was in the first grade. I didn't start school till I was 6. But yeah, I was playing tag outside at recess. Like that's what I was doing. At 10 years old, I was in the 4th grade.
Babies.
Yep.
Just fucking babies.
At 10 years old, when I was 10 years old, the boys in my class were not bigger than me. They were not physically more muscle-bound than I was.
Yeah.
There were things I could do in terms of athletic performance that none of the boys I knew could do. And even when I got older, obviously the acrobatic stuff I could do, like nobody else I knew could do that. So boys or girls, until I met an actual gymnast when I was in junior high. But at 10 years old, there was one boy in our class that was bigger than the other boys. But aside from him, everybody else, we all pretty much had the same body types. None of us had hit puberty yet. Right? My brother was stronger than me. But yeah, I like that was at 10 years old. Can you imagine at 10 years old having a responsibility as big as military service put on you?
No fucking way. No way. I didn't even like doing the dishes.
So at the tender age, yeah, I know. At 10 years old, let's see, when I was 10 years old, my mom broke her hand, and then we were in a bad car accident together, and she was really laid up. So I did a lot of housework when I was 10 years old, but I don't think it was, like, none of my classmates thought that was normal. Except the one that lived on a farm, and, like, she thought that was pretty normal. So at the tender age of 7, Nathan Futrell was the youngest drummer so far identified in the Revolutionary War. He served with the North Carolina militia. Richard Lord Jones, at the age of 10, was a fifer in the Connecticut militia. He was the youngest known enlisted soldier in the terrible fight for independence. These interesting facts were shared by Cohen Daniels, 14, state president of the Tennessee Society Children of the American Revolution, and his brother Ivan Daniels, 16, national vice president of the Mid-Southern Region and honorary state president for the TSCAR at the September meeting of the Martha Dandridge Washington Chapter, National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. Cohen spoke on the topic, America's Most Forgotten Veterans, Children. The current state project for the TSCAR is titled Stitching History Together. This article, by the way, is not a recent article. If I remember right, this is old. No, this is recent. This is more recent than I thought. This was published last year. So there's another article that I have read about this. I don't remember as much mention of the organizations, but there was a mention of TSCAR. So they do. TSCAR does some reenactment, and they do not so much LARPing as display of this is what it looked like for boys to be soldiers. But I want to skip a lot of the organizational description and get to, here we go, quite a number of, according to Cohen, quite a number of child soldiers served in the Revolutionary War, often in the capacities of fifer, drummer, and bugler. Right? And this is something that goes back to, if you look at British and the British Commonwealth militias, you saw similar use of boys in the military. And that also goes back in Scotland as well to the bagpiper being young. And the bagpiper had a pretty heavy job, and the drummers and the fifers and the buglers, they didn't just play music. They weren't just like the bard trying to encourage everybody. There were particular series of notes and beats and tones and so on that would be marching orders. And if you hear this, you do this. So they were not just there to boost morale. They actually were essential to the performance of the military. And because they were essential to the performance of the military, they were targets for the opposing military. Some also filled the ranks as spies, messengers, couriers, Indian patrol, and of course, fighting soldiers and sailors.
Indian patrol?
Yes, because you have to understand, during the Revolutionary War, there were Indian tribes that joined with the British to keep the colonists from gaining their independence.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And it's not the first time. I mean, the 7 Years' War is the part of the 7 Years' War that took place in the Americas is known as the French and Indian War.
Okay.
So yeah, like you had, and there were tribes on both sides of that, and there were tribes on both sides of the Revolutionary War. There were tribes that thought, if they sided with the colonists, that they would be treated better than the British were treating them. And then there were tribes that expected the colonists to betray the Native Americans. And if you look at history, the history of how the American government treated the tribes, I can't say that the tribes who sided with the British were wrong. Right? They lost, but they were not wrong. They were going to be betrayed. They got betrayed. Right? And there was already a pattern there for them to make a note of. So it wasn't like they were just guessing.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they did, and all of these roles, like a spy may get executed upon being found, being caught, right? Or killed fighting when they get caught. Messengers carry marching orders. They carry information about needs for supplies. Their role is absolutely vital. And killing a messenger, getting a messenger out of commission, can cripple a military action. It can cripple a military effort and cost an entire side the war. And of course, Indian Patrol, if they're reporting back on the activities of tribes that are opposed to the colonial fighters, and they get caught, they're going to get killed. So these were boys as young as 7 years old who were risking their lives doing jobs for the military. And then, of course, there were also young soldiers that were fighting, and young soldiers that were on ships. Military musicians, it just explains here, played an integral role in the battlefield. Child soldiers often worked on cannon crews, called matras crews, to assist in firing the cannons and carry water to cool the cannons and slake the thirst of cannoneers. They provided communication from officers to fighting men. Their instruments signaled attack and retreat. The success of the fighting men could hinge on the skills of the musicians. So this was no small role. So here's this list of boys that he's described here. The TSCAR has been involved in research to identify as many child soldiers as possible and collect information into a database, so that they can honor these boys for what they did. Some of the names shared by Cohen and Ivan include Daniel Applegate, 13, Pfeiffer at the surrender of Yorktown, William Cross, who began serving as a soldier at 15, later served at the Battle of Kings Mountain, Fisk Durand, 10, enlisted with his brother as a drummer in the Connecticut Infantry in 1776. So we have one girl here, I'm pretty sure. Possibly. Elisha Garland. This still actually could be Elijah, and it could be a boy. So, 13. Pfeiffer from North Carolina, who was with George Washington at Valley Forge. James Gillies, 14. Bugler for the American General, a light horse, Henry Lee. 14. Right. That's a 8th grader or a freshman in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Harry Lee, fought with Harry Lee. Gillies was killed by the sword of one of British Colonel. Gosh darn it! I'm gonna have to increase the size of this text, guys. I'm sorry. Speaking of being blind, it's the font. There we go. Bannister, Tarleton's Dragoons. I could not tell what the S was until I increased the size of the text, because on my screen, because it's up against the T, it doesn't show the whole S. It's got like a tiny little bit of it's missing. Alright, so then we have Moralist, and actually, I'm pretty sure that's Elijah, not Elisha, because I doubt that they had a girl do that job. Not that there were not female participants, right? Presley Larkins, 12, recruiter for Virginia forces and a fifer. After having smallpox, he went blind. However, once his vision was restored, and this is another thing, in the Revolutionary War, smallpox was rife. They didn't have any way to treat it other than basically you rested and they tried to manage your fever. Like there weren't antibiotics, there weren't antivirals, there were just drugs to help you treat the overt symptoms, and most of them were herbal remedies. So he was fortunate. Not everybody who went blind as a result of viruses like smallpox regained their vision. In fact, there is, if I remember right, there was it was assumed that Helen Keller's blindness was caused by virus as well, and I want to say scarlet fever, but I might be wrong. But various viruses like that would attack your system. If your fever got too high, you could have brain damage from it that would cause you to go permanently blind. You could have nerve damage as well outside the brain, and you also had things that could happen to the structure of the eye, retinal detachment and stuff like that can happen due to inflammation and a number of different factors. So you just had, if you recovered your vision like that, you were very lucky. When he recovered his vision, he returned to duty. Later he went into the War of 1812.
Wow.
William Prince, 13, was the personal fifer for Colonel John Sevier and fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain. According to oral history, Cornelius Wilson, 11, had his lip cut so badly by a British soldier's sword that he could no longer play the fife. So he became a drummer and continued to serve. And somebody actually, attacked the boy with a sword.
Good God.
William Addison was 13 when he joined the militia and 14 when he was wounded in the Battle of Eutaw Springs. His payment for that service is noted in the paybank of Brigadier General Francis Marion, better known as the brilliant and shrewd Swamp Fox. Robert Harris, 15, assisted a gunner by loading, firing, and sponging out the cannon. Joshua Pewitt, 13. John Vaughn, 15, were members of the matros crew, which used a stick to pull the debris from the old charge out of a cannon so a new charge could be loaded. Which means they had to get in front of the cannon. John McAllister began to serve at 13 and was promoted to sergeant at 15.
What?
15-year-olds, when I was in school, couldn't get a permit until 6 months before their 16th birthday to drive a car, right? So prior to that, you had not hit your first sign of adulthood. A 15-year-old couldn't take someone out on a date without relying on someone else for transportation.
Yeah.
Right? 15-year-old would be a freshman or a sophomore in high school. A 15-year-old looks like a kid. Or at least a 15-year-old looks like a kid to me. But yeah, sergeant at 15. Philip Russell, 15, was a teamster and a soldier in Virginia charged with driving supplies, which again would make him a target. That included ammunition. Right? So that would really make him a target.
Oh, yeah.
Through the backcountry while guarding it from the British and the Indians. Magnus Tulloch, 13, was a fifer who later became a fighter and saw 5 years of combat. He is buried in the Builders Creek Church Graveyard in Blount County, Tennessee. On April 12th, 2023, the T-Scar family formally marked his grave. The Justice brothers, Simon 11 and John 14, were captured by the British in the 96th district in South Carolina, but were later released. In those days, according to Ivan, boys were considered to be adults at the age of 10.
God damn it.
All right, we hear all about child marriage and girls.
Yeah.
Right? Under British common law, under English law even, during the 13th century, the age of consent for girls was 13. 3 years older than for boys to be considered adults.
My God.
Senior Sticks gives us $2 and mentions about normal school. Was there a normal school prom, yearbook, glee club? I'm assuming. I don't know. No, the normal school was only like 6 weeks long. So they would have just had 6 weeks of sitting in a classroom studying and going home and studying and then taking tests and proceeding on to the next lesson. And then they would be done. They might have a graduation ceremony, but at the end of it, they got a certificate. So, yeah. Let's see. So, adults at the age of 10. James Servier, son of frontier soldier and statesman Colonel John Servier, actually Sevier. I'm seeing an R in there where there isn't one. Fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain and was given the task of counting the wounded. So here, this is a boy that had to actually go around. The wounded in a battle like that would have been hit with musket balls. And when you get shot with a bullet, it goes in and it goes out, and it's usually, unless it's like a weaker type of caliber, you're going to see a straight line front to back. It goes out, or back to front, wherever you're shot. But a musket ball bounced around inside, broke bones. It tore through people. The exit wound would have been bigger. People would have been in agony. The men that they ran across that were injured could have been... These would have been men who were actively dying, or men who were in just absolute states of torture. Not that getting shot today is a cakewalk or anything, but it was even worse then. And that's the men that were shot. They fought with muskets and swords. Or, you also had men that were hit with cannonballs. You had men that were hit with debris from when cannonballs hit structures and landscapes and threw rocks and things in the air. There would have been people with horrific injuries that these boys would have been identifying. So after this organization makes this presentation, the boys actually performed a number of songs that were played during the Revolutionary War, and this is a really neat organization that honors children who were forced to fight in war, who were in that situation. Nobody asked them, and of course, if they did, these boys wouldn't have known what they were getting into.
Yeah.
So this is basically, you understand, for males, not only was their obligation, but that obligation included roles that were life-risking, horrifying. These boys would have come out of this, if they came out of it alive, they would have come out of it with PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Their whole lives would have been changed. Right? So we look at that, and we look at the draft. We understand the creation of the system that allows us the freedom to be governed with consent. It's entirely built in blocks of blood, in the blood of men and the blood of boys. So when we talk about the draft today, we're talking about a long historical tradition from which women have been exempt. And when we talk about the connection of voting rights to that, we are talking about a long and historical relationship between the public and the government that has been fueled by the blood of men and boys. But are women useless in that? Do we have an excuse as a society for saying, well, women can vote, but they don't have to serve? And
No.
previous episodes, we've discussed that, haven't we?
Yeah, I believe so.
The episode where we talked about the strength of women in Neolithic times, for instance, and the existence of women warriors prior to modern times, kind of indicates that maybe there are things women can do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So in the Revolutionary War, there were women doing things that you wouldn't expect necessarily women to do. Now, this isn't to say that we're going to say, oh, women should be drafted and should be fighting on the front lines beside men, and men should be relying on women to have their backs. And we know that wouldn't be necessarily the best thing for men, but it shouldn't be a get out of responsibility free card for women.
Yeah.
So we're going to skip down to all right. I had this. I must have jumped back up. It must have reloaded. All right. So, yeah. Women often followed their husbands in the Continental Army. This is where it was. Women often followed their husbands in the Continental Army. These women, known as camp followers, often tended to the domestic side of Army organization, washing, cooking, mending clothes, providing medical help when necessary. Sometimes they were flung into the vortex of battle. Such was the case of Mary Ludwig Hayes, better known as Molly Pitcher, who earned fame at the Battle of Monmouth, I think I'm pronouncing that right, in 1778. Hayes first brought soldiers water from a local well to quench their thirst on an extremely hot and humid day, and then replaced her wounded husband, at his artillery piece, firing at the oncoming British. In a similar vein, Margaret Corbin was severely wounded during the British assault on Fort Washington in November 1776 and left for dead alongside her husband, also an artilleryman, until she was attended by a physician. She lived, though her wounds left her permanently disabled. History recalls her as the first American female to receive a soldier's lifetime pension after the war. Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved African-American living in Boston, took up the pen and wrote poetry, becoming one of the first published female authors in America and the first African-American woman to be published. Her 1773 collection of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, was popular on both sides of the Atlantic. Her poems focused on patriotism and human virtues. She even wrote a poem about George Washington, to His Excellency George Washington, in 1775. So, various things that women can do. Like, we see men employed in the military in everything from these domestic roles to the propaganda department to, like, they might not call it that, but basically getting people to agree with the war and intimidating the other side. These are not things that women can't do. New York teenager Sybil Ludington was the female equivalent of Paul Revere. Though she rode twice as far as Paul Revere, and in a driving rainstorm in April 1777. Her ride took her through Putnam in Dutchess counties, New York, where she roused local militia to fight a British force that had attacked nearby Danbury, Connecticut. The Daughters of the American Revolution erected a heroic equestrian statue to Ludington in Carmel, New York. We're going to skip Betsy Ross because there's some belief that she actually did what she was reputed to do. There's also some belief that she didn't. Not really something that I don't want to get into that debate. But those were just some individual women. There are women who were spies in the Revolutionary War, but for the most part, aside from the few women, there was also a woman who disguised herself as a man and enlisted and fought, and she fought until she was injured badly enough that she couldn't get out of receiving treatment from a physician, at which point she was identified by the physician as a woman, and she was honorably discharged, but then she had to fight for her pension because she wasn't supposed to be in the military because she was a woman. But she was taller than the men. She pretended to be a teenager. And she actually fought for quite some time, so it wasn't almost immediately. She had several other injuries prior to that one. I don't remember if it was in this article or another one that I read about her, but she didn't seek treatment for injuries because she knew she would be identified, but eventually the injury that she had required a doctor's care, and there wasn't anything she could do about it. And eventually she did, by the way, get her pension. So the government did make it right with her. But mostly what women did was a little different. Wives of the common soldier often followed the Continental Army, so too did the wives of general officers. Let's see. The Continental Army's artillery commander married the vivacious and popular Bostonian Lucy Flucker. There would be a ton of jokes.
I need like the ones going through my brain right now.
She's gotta be. Oh my god! So if you're not familiar with the original cast of Saturday Night Live, but in any case, this woman deserves better than that. So, the daughter of Bostonian loyalists. Once she and Henry were married, all ties between her and her family were cut. She married a revolutionary. That was it, right? Henry and Lucy were devoted to one another, and she would join him whenever she could while he was on campaign. She endured the bitter encampment at Valley Forge, and became fast friends with the wife of General Nathaniel Greene, the equally popular Kitty, George Washington's wife, Marie Curtis, spent every winter with her husband whenever the army was camped. So even women who could have, on the basis of being married to officers, so being above, they still went. And you think about it, you're in a situation where your partner, your husband, the person that you love the most in the world, is going to another part of your country to defend your country, and you don't know if you'll ever see him again when he leaves. And your choices are to sit back and let that happen, or to go and be close by to where he's going to be and do everything you can to provide care and back up as far as doing jobs and tasks that the soldiers don't have time to do for themselves. or don't know how to do for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't be able to do for themselves as well. For instance, repairing uniforms, and such. Or those sewing was pretty much the purview of women. So, ordinary women also endured the horrors of the battlefield when those fights came to their doorstep. Sally Kellogg of Vermont and her family escaped the gods of war in 1776 when the War for Independence found its way into the northern reaches of upstate New York. And Benedict Arnold's makeshift fleet and the British Navy clashed on Lake Champlain during the Battle of Valcour Island. As the Kellogg family made good its escape by water, Sally's family fell in between Arnold's fleet and the British fleet, she later recalled. As the family rode to safety, the exchange of gunfire between the ships could be seen and heard. So they're right in the middle of it. So women had to deal with the fact that the war was around them. So they couldn't just sit around and like, oh, I'm not involved here. Then there was, let's see if it's, I don't know if it's in this article, I think it's in the other one. Yeah. So I have two articles here, the daily life of a soldier versus the daily life of women in the war. And the daily life of a soldier is described as, here we go, daily life defined by routine, fatigue, and preparation for battle. The soldier marched all day, had to carry a heavy load. He had, in addition to his weapon, all of his bedding, his ammunition, any personal items he took with him. If he was lucky, he had an extra blanket. But of course, you know how much a blanket weighs, especially if it's a wool blanket. In camp, the soldier usually spent 8 hours or more practicing military drills and doing labor necessary for the maintenance of the army. They foraged for food. They had to hunt in order to supplement their rations. They wouldn't have had, like we have now, where the military stores up a lot of food, and there's a system for making sure that the soldiers have enough food. They had to chop firewood. They had to maintain the area that they lived in. They had guard duty. They cooked together. And then if they had downtime and they weren't totally beat, they would play cards, marbles, roll dice. But they might have guard duty at night. So that's outside of the fighting, right? That's their daily life, in addition to the fact that they would be shot at, that they would have cannons fired at them, that they would be attacked with swords, that they would be out in all kinds of weather, they would be completely exposed to the weather, that they would be responsible for killing people. So some of the women had to flee their homes, but in terms of what women actually did as part of the war effort, there were things like, because the men were drafted, you had areas where there weren't enough men to do the work at home that men normally did. So some women took over those roles. What did they call themselves? I'm not sure if it's in here or not. Well, they, yeah. There was a name like substitute husbands. It's not the right name. And then, of course, many chose to follow a male relative to the army and provide the services I described before, doing laundry or nursing. And they did get paid, and they did get fed. Here we go. There's the woman's name was Deborah Sampson, that dressed in men's clothes and enlisted in the 4th Massachusetts Regiment of the Continental Army under the name Robert Shirtliff. First, she tried once and got busted, and then she did it again. She's taller than the average soldier, claimed she was a teenager to avoid questions. She suffered multiple wounds but refused to go to the doctor out of fear he would discover her secret. However, when she was hospitalized, it was an illness, not an injury. So when she was hospitalized for an illness, a doctor identified Sampson as female. Soon after, she was honorably discharged from the Army, even though she had broken the rules to be there. She went home to Massachusetts, married. She did not forget her experiences and successfully petitioned the state government to pay owed to her as a soldier that she had not received because she had been discovered to be a woman. In 1797, she became a minor celebrity when a book about her time in the Army, The Female Review, was printed. She went on a speaking tour and performed military exercises on stage. And she sought a veteran's pension and succeeded with the help of Paul Revere. So this was pretty much the one woman who enlisted and fought in the Revolutionary Army. But what women normally did, again, sometimes they did help on the battlefield if they were in that situation where they were there and in the support role and circumstances pretty much made that necessary. That's what they did. Because when you're in an emergency situation, you deal with the emergency at hand, not what people are going to think about it later. So, let's see if we have... Yeah, camp followers. Before the moments that brought them fame on the battlefield, both Margaret Corbin and Mary Hayes had traveled with the Army as camp followers. Both the Continental and British Army included thousands of women and children camp followers, traditionally wives and children of soldiers. Statistics show that for the American Army, there was at least one woman to every 24 soldiers. For the Hessians, the German soldiers who served alongside the British Army, the ratio is 1 to 15. For the British Army itself, the ratio at one point was 1 woman to every 8 soldiers.
Wow.
So now, I know Night Motorcyclist isn't trusting this because women keep revising history, but this isn't new information. Like, this is information that has been known since the time of the war itself. So, again, as I discuss this, we're not talking about women in the Revolutionary War because women are something special and great, or that it in any way takes away from what the men did. You have to understand the point of this is that when we hear that it's unfair to suggest that women should be as responsible for a draft as men are, that you should either be drafting both sexes or neither, you can look at history and prove that it is actually perfectly fair to conscript both sexes instead of just one, or to exempt both sexes, because even if you don't conscript women to fight on the front lines, you can conscript women to do jobs for the military. Quicksilver Tongue says, no Mike today. No, unfortunately, Mike is visiting family, so he's not able to be here. So,
he will be back next week.
Yes, he will be back next week. But yeah, so you look at this, it is still men's blood that paid the price for this revolution, just like every revolution. And it is still men and boys who fought the battles, who won freedom, and who went into it either knowing or not knowing the risks. But that does not exempt women from responsibility for being a part of the defense of their country.
Yeah.
Even, like, if you look at someone like me, right? My health has always been shit. It's never been good. At its best, it was still not as good as most of the people around me. But there are things I could do. Right? I worked as a nurse's aide. I've worked as a baker, and I've worked as a cook. It would be unfair to say that if a military conflict were to happen on American soil and men were fighting, and the 14% of the military that are women were fighting, even though I might not be qualified to do what they are doing, neither in terms of physical aptitude, physical capabilities, or competence with weapons and tactics, it would be unfair for me to sit on my ass and say, well, there's nothing I can do.
Right.
Because there damn well is stuff I could do, right? And that is the point.
Yeah.
These women, even though they weren't the ones going out and facing musket fire and cannon fire for the most part, like, there were some names, that definitely did. But for the most part, what these women were doing was taking some of the other burden off of these men that would have been on them so that they could focus on coming back alive.
Mm-hmm.
And they had rules, right? To get that pay, to be part of, to be a camp follower, these women and children performed a variety of duties. They weren't just lightweight things, right? You couldn't just throw things in a washing machine. So when they're laundering soldiers' uniforms, you're talking about boiling water and mixing it with cold water so that you have hot water, or washing in ice cold water. You're talking about carrying water in big buckets because they didn't exactly have plumbing out there. They didn't have cisterns. They didn't have anything that. So they're toting heavy buckets. When they wash that laundry, they're sticking a washboard down into that water and plunging their hand down in over and over again to rub the laundry on the washboard to get the stains out. They're sewing.
The blood.
Yep, the blood. They're sewing. They're cooking. They're making sure that the soldiers had the things they need. And as it says here, since soldiers did not often have time to clean their bodies, they didn't get to bathe, especially in the wintertime, having laundered uniforms helped to keep soldiers cleaner and healthier than they otherwise might have been. And it boosted morale, because it helped them look, they felt like soldiers. They looked professional. But even more important than that was the nursing, right? Because they were going to come back wounded. And there aren't, at that point in time, there's not a bunch of extra men and extra boys that could do this, right? They're suffering from, either they're too young or too old, too infirm, or they're suffering from injuries. They're suffering from diseases, smallpox, like Night Motorcyclist mentioned. You have, if they're not in battle, it's because they're disabled completely in terms of doing these things. So if you wanted people to apply bandages and people to bring them food and water when they're injured, people to basically play the support role when military doctors had to amputate limbs, and you had to have women there. Camp followers nursed the wounded and cared for the sick, working alongside the few army doctors. They served as merchants called sutlers, so they went and got supplies and then sold them back. They were basically the canteen.
Mm.
Others were middlemen who purchased goods and sold them to soldiers. Camp followers supported the army by repairing clothing and other fabric goods, and tents were made out of fabric. Carrying supplies, cooking food. They were so critical to the functioning of each army that they were considered a formal part of the armies and were issued food rations and pay for their work. So one of the, we go back to the beginning of the show, like, these women would have slapped the shit out of the women that I talked to today on Twitter.
Oh my God. Yes, they would have. I'd love to see that. Oh my God. And not only would the women today wouldn't last a day in these women's shoes.
Yeah.
Impossible.
No. Like, when you talk about how women should be, what women should do, what is the ideal character of a woman? Now, my opinion, the ideal character of a woman is somebody who, when she sees that something like this is happening in her community, she doesn't step up and say, well, just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I can't do this or that, and you have to let me. She looks for how she can serve, even if it's not glorious, right? And I watched my grandmother be that woman and my mother be that woman throughout my life, throughout my knowing them in their lives. And that's how I learned how to be a woman. Right? A woman should not look at life in terms of everything men have, I deserve also.
Yeah.
Just because I exist. Should be looking at life in terms of everything men do to earn what they have, there's an equivalent. There's a way for me to earn what I have too.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be the same. It doesn't have to be as pretty or ugly. It doesn't have to be as deserving of what men go through and more. Women don't even understand, for the most part, I think. The horror of knowing that something might rip through your flesh and kill you because you are where you are doing what you're doing. And then going and doing it anyway is not something that women ever really have to confront. And I'm betting you that there are going to be feminist chicks in the comments going, pregnancy and bullshit.
Right.
Bull fucking shit. Right? You can't compare pregnancy to a musket ball or a bullet or a cannonball, a sword, a knife.
But Hannah, some women die during pregnancy. Don't you know how dangerous it is for women to be
right?
pregnant?
Also, pregnancy is voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
Women don't like to hear that either. But pregnancy from consensual sex is voluntary. You have a bunch of tools to stop that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, I don't even want to hear it, right? But, yeah. Night Motorcyclist says, women claim they are carrying a cannonball in them. Well, I don't know how much a cannonball weighs. But most babies born today are not 10 pounds. They're less than 10 pounds, right? It's normal for a baby to be 6 or 7 pounds. An 8-pound baby is pretty good sized, right? Mine was a 9-pounder, and I had to have him cut out of me.
Oof.
So, yeah, I guess it depends on the size of the cannonball and the material it's made out of, but I doubt it. And then, of course, obviously, the other thing is cannonballs don't kick you. I swear to you guys, the whole time I was pregnant, my son was in there playing basketball. We walking along, kaboing, 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 kaboing. You gotta be kidding me. But yeah, no, none of that. That was always funny. Like that was hilarious. You could actually see when I got close to childbirth, he'd move, and babies will move left to right. They'll turn, get into a more comfortable position. Like especially if you go from standing to sitting, or you're laying on your left side and you roll over onto your right side, the baby has a position that they prefer, and they'll move, and you can see the elbow or the knee or the arm like sticking out and going across the belly. It's bizarre. Like it's quite obvious that there is a living organism independently moving inside of you. It's an amazing experience. So when women who play victim of that, I don't have any sympathy for that, because I was constantly floored by it. But yeah, point being that you don't. There's a glorification that happens. It's maybe not necessarily right in terms of war and the sacrifices that men go through. They should be honored, but they shouldn't be honored in a way that makes them feel obligated to do that, regardless of the cause. Right? The honor should be that you understand, you value the cause, and you risked yourself by choice, or you risked yourself because you had to, and people owe you because you did that. They owe you a level of respect for what you did, and gratitude.
Yeah.
But women shouldn't be looking at that and saying, I deserve some of that, I deserve a piece of that. Right? Because you're not part of a team if you're only willing to be on the team to get that. You're part of a team if you look at the goal that the team is trying to achieve, and you look for a way to further the team's progress toward that goal, even if it is something that other people are never going to consider equal to what other teammates did.
Yeah, it's a slap in the face to the people who actually got in there and did the work,
Yeah.
But that's what they don't want to do, is the work.
I look at it in terms of medicine, because like that's part of my experience, and in terms of sports teams, because that's part of my experience. I was really good at the hurdles when I was in school. I was also on the cross country team, right? I sucked as a cross country runner. I was the last runner on our team, and I was often the last runner in the entire race. Like I was that person that people were worried about whether she was going to finish or not, right? Whether you were going to go running back through the course and find a body on the ground because the individual that you were looking for had suffocated. And I never needed to be credited as being first place runner as part of that team. I never had to be the person that oh, you're a cross country runner, that's so tough, look at how great you are. I was just glad they let me be on the team even though I sucked. And I was glad that on occasion I could contribute points. Right? And there was one time that we lost our first place runner to a hole in the ground. She didn't fall in, she sprained her ankle in it. But because of that, I became important, which really was intimidating at the time. So I'm running along, and which for me meant stumbling blindly forward and catching myself with my feet. And the whole time I sound like I'm dying. And all of a sudden there's my coach and one of the other runners on the team yelling at me that Kelly is down and I have to beat the girl in front of me in order for us to maintain our lead. The girl in front of me is like 50 yards in front of me, and I have to catch up to her, and I'm dying. And so I like the whole time, the cheering of my teammates helped to sort of light a fire under my butt. And I sort of dredged up, all right, I'm going to do this. Because you could also see it wasn't close, but it was visible. There's the finish line. And so I didn't have a whole lot of time to catch up to her and beat her.
Yeah.
So I went into there's a final sprint that you do at the end of a cross-country race if you can find that inner fire. Some people just don't. They can't. But when I did that, when I started that, I immediately started having an asthma attack. So if you ever heard the sound effects they use for when there's two guys with one of those big band saws, I think that's what it's called, in the woods cutting down a tree, like the big long, 6-foot long saw, that's what my breathing sounded like.
Oh my God.
And I stretched my legs out as far as I could, which, that helped a lot because I was taller than the other girl. And I barely caught up to her. Well, at that point, she heard me coming. And she stopped. And she turned around. And she looked at me. Because, this thing coming up behind her sounded like a train wreck happening. And I kept going. It's like I was sprinting in slow motion. And I kept going, and I could hear her coach going, "What are you doing? Run!" And she's just looking at me. Her jaw is on her chest. But I beat her. I beat that one girl. And that took us from second place into first place.
Wow.
And
wow.
made 1 point. There was 1 point difference between the two places. She was not on the team that we took down a peg either. So, but it was funny. And that's like probably the biggest moment I had in cross country the entire time I ran. And she wasn't stopping to help me, by the way. She just was shocked.
Wow. Oh my
Just
God.
so people know.
I have asthma, so I know exactly what you're talking about. Oh my God, you poor thing.
I passed out immediately after the race. And I didn't, thank God for my dad. Because if you stop after a run like that, you cramp. Kind of like getting the bends. So what he did was he threw my arm over his shoulder and his arm around my waist and walked me. And I remember getting to the finish line and him getting me into that position and putting my inhaler in my mouth. And I remember breathing in and getting the nasty taste from the inhaler because it's like somebody stuck something that sucks all the moisture out of your mouth. Right? And then I was many yards away from the finish line, which they have, the way they do the finish line is they set up like a funnel marking with yardsticks poked into the ground and ribbon tied to it, so it's wider at the opening and narrower where you exit. Several yards away from that, and my dad is, are you okay? Talking to me and everything. We had walked, and I had moved my legs walking the whole time. I was completely unconscious. I did that a couple of times with him, where he just kept me going, and he did that at every event.
Wow.
If my dad hadn't been there doing that, I would not have been able to even participate, right? But I was never the most important person on the team. And it never occurred to me that was a problem. It never should have occurred to me, because it wasn't, right? The most important people on the team are the top 5 runners. And that's, you work hard to push yourself to be good teammates to them. and good backup and an inspiration. The person that they have to continue to beat you to stay in that top 5. But if you have to think of yourself as being the most important person on the team, you're in the wrong sport. And when it comes to life, women should be ready to understand that about a lot of things. Men are bigger than us. They are stronger than us. They have thicker bones than we have. Men have a lot of physical characteristics that make them more suited for some things that we're not as well suited for on the whole. And so you find there will be a significant number more men doing those things than women. And that's fair. Women shouldn't feel left out. Right? What we should be doing is saying, well, what are we good at? What can we do? Let's do that. And that's what these women did. So when we look at the history of suffrage and conscription and fighting for human rights recognition and fighting for independent, like, not self-governance, but independent consent to be governed. It is irrational and unreasonable for our society to say, well, women should have all the same rights as men, but should just be totally exempt from those dirty, ugly parts.
Right. The icky bits. Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, no, you're not exempt. Maybe maybe the dirty, ugly parts you handle aren't going to be the same as the ones they handle. Maybe you're the person who is holding somebody's hand and holding their leg down when the doctor has to cut off their foot.
Ooh.
That's horrible, right? Think of what's the scene in Gone with the Wind, where Scarlett is working as a nurse, and the man is yelling, don't cut, right before he gets his leg amputated because of gangrene. It would still be a gut-wrenching, horrifying thing to help with. His experience is obviously the worst experience in that situation.
Right.
The doctor's experience is pretty terrible because that's certainly not the thing that's ideal for him to do. But just because your experience isn't the worst experience in that moment doesn't mean that you shouldn't struggle to be a help.
Right. Right.
I know you have any other thoughts on the matter?
It's just really sad to see how weak women have become, and demanding. And they just don't deserve. They're not deserving of it, really. But I don't know. I don't really have any more thoughts other than that. God, the child soldier thing just really threw me.
Yeah. Imagine being 15 years old, and you're not only in the military, but you're expected to exercise authority and take responsibility for the people under you. Like, what were you doing when you were 15?
Actually, I graduated high school when I was 15.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah, but I mean, I really didn't do anything with it. I wanted to go on to college, but I wanted to go out of state to a college I was accepted to for a nursing class. But because I was so young, my parents weren't having that,
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It is what it is. But
it's kind of a difficult thing. It's hard to make that kind of decision as parents, You want your kid to be a kid while they can be a kid. But sometimes the best time to learn new things is during that age when your brain still has that level of plasticity.
Yeah, it is the best time.
Yeah. there's a lot of things I wish I'd done when I was that age. When I went to college, I shouldn't have gone with the intention of becoming a school teacher. If I'd understood what the school system was at the time, I wouldn't have. I'd have gone for something else. Probably would have gotten a nursing degree. Although at the time that I went, I had some issues that I should have addressed before ever setting foot at a university. But all that aside, yeah, I think most people, like when I was 15, I was scaring the shit out of some girl on some other school's cross-country team. I had my first paying job. I wasn't able to drive yet. I actually had to ride to events that I was photographing with the reporter that was covering the event because I couldn't drive myself there. But yeah, and that's the sergeant age, right? The youngest boy, age 7. That's a first grader. At the age of a first grader, a boy was responsible for playing the instrument that told the soldiers in his area, within hearing distance of him, to attack or retreat, or do particular things in an attack or a retreat. Like that's a heavy responsibility.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he was out there, practicing with the rest of the soldiers too,
And he was a target.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he wasn't just responsible for, I have to do this right or people will die. On top of, I have to do this right or people will die, it was, I have to do this right under fire.
Yeah.
I have to do this right while my life is at risk. Like, that's masculinity in comparison to femininity, right? We have, women don't have to be useless.
They just choose to be.
Right? Women don't have to be useless. Women don't have to be exempt from hardship.
Mm-hmm.
But they also don't have to do that. They're not obligated to do that. So it's just unfair when people argue that we can't draft women because it's just too hard for women to deal with the rigors of the military, when there are things that women clearly can do. But at the same time, to say, well, women are just as capable as men. How many 7-year-old girls can you imagine? You take a 7-year-old girl and you tell her, all right, you're going to learn to play this instrument, and then you're going to go out into this area where there are blood and guts, scary things that you've never seen before in your life, and you might be shot or stabbed. It's freezing cold. There's snow on the ground. Wild animals might get you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, get out there.
Yeah. Yeah. No. But I think it's fucking hilarious. 7, 10 young little boys have the responsibilities that grown women will not. They would. Oh no, they turn their nose up at.
They weren't expected to handle that. They did not ask women to do those jobs.
God.
So there we go. But it's 9 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and call it. So I think we've pretty well established 2 things in this episode from the beginning of the United States. From before we were states and when we were colonies, there was conscription. Men were obligated, women were not, right? That was one thing. But also, that doesn't mean that women just should have a get-out-of-responsibility-free card. Because, obviously, even if you are not conscripting women to fight, there are things you can conscript women to do.
Mm-hmm.
So it is unfair for women to have no obligation at all.
Absolutely. Absolutely right.
Yeah. And so we look at, I don't have any more super chows. And I've read all the super chats. I like Quicksilver Tongue. And today's 10-year-old girls are responsible for promoting Taylor Swift's new concert on social media. Oh, cut your crap
Yeah.
with me. No. If my girls were that young, like, I think I would have taught them not to give free advertisement to bimbos. But
They
yeah.
wouldn't be on social media at all. My God.
Mr. 303 wants the drill scene from Full Metal Jacket, but with women. Yeah. Mangaka92 says it's equally unfair for women to get to wash laundry while men get their brains blown out. And it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is. But at the same time, I think it's unfair. It would also be unfair to put a man's life in a woman's hands if she is not going to be able to hold up her end. Right? I think if women do get drafted for combat, it's important that the women have their own units and they're not side by side with the men. Because I don't think women and men are equally yoked today. And until that would until that would change, I would not object. I would not, if women want to have fighting units that are all women and risk their lives together, that's their business. But to turn to a man and say, you have to depend on me to protect you, I think that would be unfair.
Mm-hmm.
That would sacrifice his safety. The IDF, I don't know what the IDF is. Night Motorcyclist says the IDF found mixed and has to be a liability.
The Israeli Defense.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading about when they started that, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, women and men can look. Israel's doing it. Israel's doing it," and then they discontinued it.
Did they?
They're not mixed. They're I think they're segregated now. Because I remember reading about that as well. That they found that when you put the men and the women together, there are two things that happen that are dangerous to the men. One of them is the women don't hold up their end, and the other one is that the men will sacrifice themselves to protect the women.
Jeez. Yeah, I can totally see that. God damn.
Yeah. So yeah, if you want women to fight, you have to have them as a team, separate from the men, or you end up with that kind of problem. Quicksilver Tongue says if you don't buy a 10-year-old girl the latest iPhone, that's probably counted as child abuse today.
Yeah.
If I had kids that age right now, and I was responsible for them, forget about iPhone. They would not have phones at that age.
Mm-mm. Absolutely no way.
Like the only thing that could persuade me to give my kid a phone would be as if I was worried that they were not safe at school. And if I was that worried that they were not safe at school, I wouldn't send them to that school.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I say this, I don't have kids, but in my hypothetical, if I had children situation, I wouldn't be working. I would be home with them, probably homeschooling them, It just, there would be no need for them to have their own phone.
Yeah. Like, this is something that people don't understand today. And it's amazing to me how many people my age that don't understand this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We grew up without... When I was a kid, the phone in our house wasn't just plugged into the wall. It was mounted to the wall.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't even take the phone into another room to have a conversation. You
Yeah.
went to where the phone was, and you had a chair by where the phone was so you could sit down. Like a lot of people had phones that sat on a coffee table or something like that. But our phone was actually the type that you mounted onto a thing attached to the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yeah, ours was in the kitchen.
Yeah, we had our house had my parents enclosed what had been a patio. They added a room there. They put it they put a family room. Like it was like a living room. It'd be almost like a parlor, except that we used it all the time, so it wasn't just for when guests were over. And in between the kitchen, which had sort of had a dining room area that was all open. There was no doors or closed walls in between us, so it was like one great big L-shaped room. And on the post in between where the door to the outside used to be, that's where our phone was mounted. So you could be in the family room, or you could be in the kitchen, and we had a phone cord that was long enough that you could sit down, but then if anybody wanted to walk through the room, they had to walk over or under it.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, we had a rotary phone. But yeah, I just no. I don't think I would like the idea of having a 10-year-old with a smartphone. My kids grew up with no privacy on the computer. They grew up with when my stepdaughters had phones, their mom gave them in high school and everything. We kind of developed a habit of showing each other, this is what's on the look, I got this meme, I found this thing, this is funny, haha, I got this text, blah blah, this video came from your uncle. And so even then, they didn't really have screen privacy. It's a bad idea. Your kids should not have screen privacy from their parents.
No way. Just invites too many problems,
Yeah. But yeah. Senior Six gave us $2 and said, just give them old school flip phones for 80 style. Do those even still work?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that.
And my husband is nodding his head. They still work. They are fragile though, yeah. But well, and actually in the 80s, I don't think flip phones existed in the 80s. The mobile phones that existed in the 80s came in a bag. They plugged into your cigarette lighter in your car, and it was like $7.50 a minute for phone calls. So yeah, it was really expensive, and it was the size of a brick. And there were like maybe one or two companies that you could get them from, and you paid for a contract on top of that. By the way, it was expensive. You paid through the nose to get the phone, and then you also had a monthly contract fee for service, which got you absolutely nothing except that you had a phone number and the phone number worked, right? And then if you used the service, you had to pay by the minute for your use. And there was no such thing as text messaging. So what most people had clear up into the late 90s instead was a little device that would be attached to a number that when somebody called it, it would beep and then you would go call them back. And that's a pager. If somebody has one of those today, you have just found a drug dealer. But it used to be, like doctors would have pagers, and people, lawyers would have pagers. People who were on call would have pagers, so that they would know that somebody was trying to get in touch with them because you couldn't just call them. So that's that. But yeah, it is after 9 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and call it. I don't think we have anything more to talk about on the subject. I think I've pretty much established that, the feminists are kind of bullshitting us when they act like it's the reason that women are exempt from any kind of service today is because women just have always been not expected to contribute anything to the war effort. Maybe they haven't been on the front lines. Maybe they haven't been doing the things that are frequently glorified by war historians. But that doesn't mean that they just got to sit around on their butts like women today.
Yeah, they were every bit as necessary.
Right. And it's important for women to remember that level of responsibility and take it up and exercise it, because when you put everything on the men and then you still get to vote, you are more willing to vote to make those sacrifices. It's easier to sacrifice something that somebody else has to pay than when you have obligation, even if it's not the same sacrifice.
Yeah.
So that's my conclusion. So let me know what you think. You guys let us know in the comments what would you think would be the ideal way to handle equal obligation in terms of military obligation in wartime and service obligation in the country in order to justify equal voting rights. And with that, thanks everybody for listening. Thanks to my awesome co-host for contributing to the conversation and being here for all of the weird stuff that we went through tonight. And thanks to everybody who works in the background to make HBR Talk happen. Good night, all.
Good night, y'all. We'll see you next Thursday.
See you next Thursday.
Men's rights activists are machines, dude. Okay? They are literal machines. They are talking point machines. They are impossible to fucking deal with, especially if you have like a couple dudes who have good memory on top of that too. Holy shit, you're fucked.